Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Meinen Jesum, nicht, which translates to I shall not leave my Jesus. This is a really interesting chorale. There's some harmonic moments in this particular setting of this melody that are super unusual. I don't know really what to make of them as far as a definitive analysis is concerned. There are definitely multiple possibilities that anyone could stick with in their own analysis and make an argument for, but I'm going to present some multiple viewpoints on the chords in question and hopefully get through this chorale. I don't imagine it's going to be too much of a problem, but two sharps in the key signature. We start on D major, we end on D major. I reckon we're in the key of D major, and we pretty much stay in the key of D major throughout. A couple of deviations to A major, which is a likely destination in a major key to go to the dominant. But other than that, really, and no other modulation. So after our initial tonic triad, we have two passing tones in the alto and the bass. We then have F sharp, D, A, and A. That's D major in first inversion, so we'll just change the figured bass to reflect that. This D is a chord tone, kind of puts it in root position but gets rid of the third of the chord, so I'm not going to mark it down on the page, but it's there. We then have G, D, A, and B. Our first culprit. Now, one way that we can analyze this is if we look at this F sharp as our chord tone, we have F sharp, D, A, and B, which is B minor 7 over F sharp, which would be 6, 4, 3, because it would be in second inversion. However, I think that this A is actually a 9/8 suspension over the bass, and this is actually a 4 chord. And this F sharp is just a neighbor tone. So however you choose to analyze it, they're more or less functioning the same way. I just think that this 4 chord is more of a likely analysis, and we're going to see this mode of use throughout the chorale as well, so it's going to be consistent with it, which kind of verifies the analysis or strengthens my argument. We then have G, E, G, and B. This is where we get interesting because we would expect the resolution down, which we do. The 9/8 suspension does resolve downward, but the chord turns into E minor, G, E, G, and B, which is E minor in first inversion, which would be 2/6. And as we close in on a cadence, that's a chord that we would expect, a 2/6 chord. And this cadence is a perfect authentic cadence, by the by. We then have A, E, G, and C sharp. That is A7 in root position, which is 5/7. This G is a chord tone, this E is a chord tone, we don't need to mark them. And this is where it gets kind of interesting because this 5/7 we would expect to go to 1, but we get a bit of a detour here because the melody does not immediately go to D. We have two leading tones in sequence, or in succession, not in sequence. That's a word that has its own definition in music, especially the music of Bach's time. You see a lot of sequenced material. Like this in the bass line right here. This is a sequence over these 3 beats. Here we have F sharp, A, and C sharp. Now, you could literally mark this as a 3 chord, F sharp minor, but I don't really think that that's what's happening here. As we know, Bach gets contrapuntal, especially in his cadences as far as the chorales are concerned, so picking apart chords, you have to be a little bit more liberal with your analysis, and I do look at this whole 2-beat gesture as dominant, so I think what's really happening here is E, A, G, and C sharp, which is just taking this 5/7 chord and inverting it twice. This time it's in second inversion before we cadence on D major, D, A, F sharp, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. So an unusual perfect authentic cadence, but a perfect authentic cadence nonetheless. It follows the structure that a perfect authentic cadence would have, but its configuration, or the pattern that's used to arrive at the tonic, is not usual. This is the only time I've ever encountered this particular cadential structure in any of the chorales so far, but I'll tuck it into the memory banks and see if we encounter it at a later date. But as we look ahead, we have our first of 2 modulations to A major. This is a phrase that ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A major, and we might as well modulate straight ahead. Actually, I take that back. We're going to modulate on beat 2. We start off with A major, A, C sharp, A, and E, which is our 5 chord. Passing tone in the bass, we have C sharp, A, and E, which is A major in first inversion. We're seeing a parallel here between the two keys, and the chord kind of goes to root position right here. I'm going to say that it modulates over this A major over C sharp here, just because we don't really have much to go off of. We might as well, we could be going to another D major chord after this. We're not. We have some of the we actually are going to another D major chord after this, but because it's functioning kind of like a 7 chord, we're going to talk about it when we get to it. Typically when we have a modulation that occurs over a chord, a common chord that repeats, I do it at the end, just because we don't, that chord is stagnant. We don't know, or not stagnant, static, so we don't know where the chord's going to go until after the chord, so might as well mark the modulation at the end of it. But you could say that it modulates as early as the D major, actually, but I think it happens closer to the accidental, but not on it. Okay, this is where it gets kind of interesting, because remember here we had some interpretive gesture going on, and if we remember, we have a similar thing going on in the alto here. We have A going down to G, but this time it's G sharp rather than G natural. So with that argument, we know we could say that B, C sharp, A, and D. If we try to factor, we can't really factor that G sharp into this chord here to make it work as a suspension this time. So I think he's taking a similar pattern and not using it as a suspension in this case. So I think what's actually happening is this B is an accented non-chord tone, and we have a very unusual chord. We have C sharp, A, and D, and this is really the best way I can make sense of it, because honestly it's a very wonky chord. I guess we could make the argument that this is a 9/8 suspension in the tenor, and it's actually B, B, A, and D, which would imply a 2-6-5 chord incomplete in the key of A major. But ultimately, I don't think it really matters too much where the chord is going to, because both this chord and what I think the chord is are doing the same thing. So it could be a 2-6-5 chord. Apologies. That would if this were a suspension, that would be the case. But I think this is a non-chord tone. It's actually C sharp, A, and D, which is an incomplete D major 7 chord in third inversion. So 5-4-2. So this C sharp is the 7th of the chord, and then it eventually does resolve down on the offbeat here. Really, I think that some type of predominant chord is happening here, because what happens afterwards, I think, is a 7 chord. We have G sharp, D, and B, which is a G sharp diminished over D, which is 7-6-4. Kind of unusual context in which a 6-4 chord is being used, but Bach has been known to break that convention in the past. You could of course also make the argument that instead of this F sharp being a leading tone, we could say that this G sharp is an accented non-chord tone, and this is just taking the chord and putting it in root position where we have B, B, F sharp, and D, which is just a 2 chord in root position, so we can make that into 8-5-3. So either analysis I think works. However, the fact that a 4-7 and then of course a 1 progression, the fact that it can be extrapolated from the notes that are happening in this texture, I think that that's telling of the fact that there is a dominant preceded by a predominant and succeeded by a tonic. So I think that that's the general gist of what's going on here, at least the way that I hear it, even though it's buried in counterpoint. Definitely some interesting harmonic interplay going on here, which is fascinating to analyze. I still don't know how to make ends of it exactly, but this is the closest analysis that I do have. Regardless, we have C sharp, B, E, and C sharp here. I think this D is an accented non-chord tone, and this B is an accented non-chord tone, and what's being implied here is a 1-6 chord. But of course, the counterpoint that's going on as we close in on the cadence, even though we're not exactly there, just like the previous chorales, Bach has been implying chords and derailing them by adding non-chord tones over the resolution. So I do think this is a 7-6 suspension over the bass that gets interrupted by the fact that the bass is upward stepping with this D here, but I still think this is a 1-6 chord. You could, however, make the argument that this is a 3-7 chord if you literally look at it as C sharp, B, E, and C sharp incomplete, but still kind of like a deceptive progression if you pull apart all of the notes and look at it literally. But in counterpoint, I think you have to be a little bit more liberal and creative with your analysis, because if you can pull notes out of the texture, it's much more like analyzing counterpoints, much more like analyzing instrumental music. Sometimes you're going to get scalar passages, but a chord still is implied. There is harmonic trajectory that you can pull out of the texture, kind of like a Schenkerian style, without too much of a reduction. Still paying respect to the fact that there are chords that are happening in their respective places on the harmonic rhythm, rather than reducing the whole phrase down to, a couple of chords or a couple of notes that signify the general trend of the trajectory. But regardless, I pulled out a 4-7-1 progression out of this interesting section with its non-chord tones and derailed resolutions. We then have E, A, E, and B, and again, I think we have another interesting case here where we have a 4-3 suspension over the bass, or kind of similar where we have this A being suspended in one of the voices here. So I do think this is an E major chord that's being implied. This C sharp is a non-chord tone. The C sharp is a non-chord tone, as well as this D in the melody before we get an interesting cadence. We have 5, and then 5 wraps back around because of the interesting sort of metric placement of everything here. 5 doesn't, we could have had a cadence right here, but the melody just doesn't allow for that to happen structurally without Bach having to modify the notes, because this A is going to be our final note that we cadence on. So here we have D, A, F sharp, and B, which is B minor 7 over D, which is 2-6-5, and then this B right here is a chord tone, and it's kind of like putting the chord in root position, but we're getting rid of the third of the chord, similar to how we are here, so we're not going to mark it. Forgot parentheses around that as well because it's having an off beat, but this B is a chord tone regardless. We then have E, G sharp, E, and B, which is our dominant E major in root position, and then we cadence on A major, A, C sharp, E, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position. So the cadence, coincidentally, is the more rhythmically tame part of this phrase, because usually we get counterpoint at the end, just like how we get more counterpoint at the end of the first phrase, but here we have this really rich rhythmic, this unrelenting bass line that is just doing its best to really drive the harmony to places that are definitely questionable and thought-provoking for sure. But looking ahead, we do go back to the key of D major for a generally more tame or tamer, sorry, not a perfect authentic cadence. That is a default because we see them more frequently than their counterpart, the imperfect authentic cadence, which is what this is. But regardless, we do modulate right away to the key of D major. This A is also functioning like our dominant, and then we get D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad now in the key of D major. It's D major in root position. We have some passing tones on the bass and the alto before we get F sharp, D, A, and A. We see something very similar, if not identical, to the first phrase. 1-6 here, so we don't need to reiterate the 1. We could just change the figure bass. Same thing here. It's not a complete D major chord because it doesn't have the third of the chord intact, so I'm not going to mark it, but it's kind of implied. Then we have G, D, A, and B. Again, I think that you could make the argument that this is a, if this G were an accented non-chord tone, you could make the argument this was B minor 7 over F sharp, if you're looking literally, but I think this A is a 9/8 suspension over the bass, and what's really being implied is a 4 chord. You could even make the argument that this is like a 6/7 or like a 2/7 chord, E minor 7 over G without the root, because the root will be introduced on the next beat. But we have a passing 7th here that then turns into E, E, G, and B, which is our 2 chord E minor in root position. So this sort of deceptive suspension almost, in the sense that it's going somewhere that we don't expect. Then we have another passing seventh in the bass here before we get C sharp, E, G, and A. That's A7 over C sharp, that's 5, 6, 5. Then we have A, C sharp, F sharp, and A. It's almost like taking the chord and putting it in root position, but that F sharp is just an accent or just an anticipation to the next beat. I guess technically you can call that a 3 chord. Like it's like F sharp minor over A. It's like a 3, 6, and we would have a bit of a subdivision, a subdivisional deceptive progression. Because we do, in the same way that we could have just cadenced off of this 2, 6, 5 chord, Bach extends it another beat, where we have 5, 6, 5 going to a predominant chord, B, D, F sharp, and G, which is G major 7 over F sharp, or 4, 6, 5. And instead of this being a plagal cadence, these passing tones or anticipations that are happening in the lower 3 voices contribute to C sharp, A, E, and G, which is A7 over C sharp, another 5, 6, 5 chord, and then we get D major, D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our tonic triad. So an interesting progression here. Again, kind of one of the themes of this chorale so far has been prolonging the cadence and defying expectations. So 5, 7 should have just gone to 1 here if we're following convention, but no, we have this interesting second inversion figure here. Here we have 5 going to 2, 6, 5 going to 5 going to 1, so transitive progression, we would expect 2 going to 5, but here we get 5, and then we get the cadence, which is interesting. And here we have 5, and we would expect 1 afterwards, especially after a 5, 6 chord, but no, we get 5, 6 going to 4, 6, then to 5, 6, then to 1, so this idea of the delayed cadence. But this, if we were calling this the end of the A section, maybe because there are 6 phrases total, and then there are 3 phrases in the first system and 3 phrases in the second system, if also including the last 2 beats of the first system, the cadence has become much tamer, much more expected. Alright, so starting things off, we have a phrase that concludes with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, so no modulation. Here we have F sharp, A, C sharp, and A, which is our median, F sharp minor in root position. Passing tone in the bass before we get D sharp, B, F sharp, and A. It's B7 over D sharp. That is a secondary dominant, which would translate to 5, 6, 5 of 2, because B, which is the root of this chord, is the dominant of E, which is our supertonic. And again, this idea of skipping down in the bass kind of turns the chord into root position, but it gets rid of the third of the chord, so that being probably the second most important chord or tone in the chord behind the root. So it's kind of happening, but I'm not going to mark it down. And then we get E, B, F sharp, and G, kind of similar to this idea here where we had a dominant resolving to a tonic, but when the resolution happens, we get derailed with a passing tone in another voice. So we know that 2 is being implied here, but when the resolution happens, this very brief 9/8 suspension just gets derailed. But when we see a 2 chord, we typically expect a 5 afterwards. We have C sharp, A, E, and G, and of course that is a 5 chord. This D is also a little brief neighbor tone. This is A7 over C sharp, which is 5, 6, 5. And again, it kind of gets turned into root position here, but the third goes away, so I'm not going to mark it. We can just talk about it. And that goes to D major, D, A, E, and F sharp. Again, with this idea of the suspension undermining the chord progression. It's beautiful, but as far as the analysis is concerned, there's always something that is throwing a wrench from in the chord progression to make it different contrapuntally. So it's a very fascinating chorale. And then we get F sharp, D, and A as well. F sharp, D, F sharp, and A. So the one chord gets arpeggiated, or part of it gets arpeggiated and gets turned into first inversion when the D gets resolved to. So unlike the other chords where the chord isn't really fully realized the way that we would expect it, this time we do have a just a respelling of the same chord, just where it's rotated. Then we have G, B, D, and E. That's E minor 7 over G, which is 2, 6, 5, and a chord that we would expect in a cadential context. Kind of gets turned into root position here, but the third goes away, so we're not going to mark it. Passing tone in the melody, and this G kind of compensates for the G being replaced by an E in the bass here, but it's so brief that I don't really think it matters too much, because this is going to be heard more as just like a linear gesture rather than as a chord on the of 4. So not super important, I think, to mark. But after a 2, 6, 5 chord, we definitely would expect some sort of 5 chord, and we do get it. We have A, D, and E, where this D is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, still implying A major though. That is a 5 chord. Neighboring 7th in the bass, and then we have A, G, C sharp, and E. That's A7 in root position, so that we will just change the figured bass to reflect the fact that the chord is now a 7 chord. And then we cadence on D major, D, F sharp, A, and D, which is our tonic triad D major. Okay, so looking ahead, we have kind of an interesting cadence. The melody tells me it is a half cadence, but I think for all intents and purposes, it's supposed to be heard as a perfect authentic cadence. Maybe you'll hear it as one or the other. I listened to it about 20 times, and at the end I convinced myself it was a perfect authentic cadence, but it definitely sounds like a half cadence when you first hear it. At least it sounded like a half cadence to me, but depending on how your ears hear it, it might change your analysis. But I'm going to analyze it in the key of A, and on the page it makes a little bit more sense because we have G sharps for pretty much half of the phrase, so the idea of A major has been perpetuated. But really, with starting from B here in the bass, this really does sound modal, almost like a B Dorian in the bass here, so that the progression is also going to reflect that. So we have B, B, F sharp, and D. That's B minor in root position. That's a 6 chord passing tone in the bass. And then we get D, D, F sharp, and B. That's like taking the B minor chord and inverting it to first inversion, so there is 6, 6 with another passing tone on the bass. At this point, we don't really know whether or not we've modulated, but on the next beat, I think we have an idea. We have F sharp, A, F sharp, and C sharp in the key of D major. That is a 3 chord, so we have a bit of a transitive progression here, 6 going to 3, and I think this is one of the confounding factors, did I use that word correctly? One of the contributing factors, that's what I wanted to say, to why this progression sounds a little modal, not just because it's just a B Dorian mode in the bass, but also because the harmony that supports it is not one that follows the normative progressions that we would expect in a tonal work. We usually expect chords that descend to 5th, or chords that are adjacent to one another in most cases. So yeah, in most cases. So the fact that we have a transitive progression where 6 is going to 3, along with the modulation occurring over sort of like this modal fragment here. It's actually less of a fragment and more like the entire mode, because we have B going to the 7th of the scale. If we had another B here, we would be it would just be the B Dorian mode. And even if that was the case, that is a mode of the A major scale, so chances are we are in the key of A major by this point. And I will make the argument that we are in the key of A major over this 3 chord. F sharp now becomes 6. So we get this idea of 6 turning into 6 in this key, and getting a lot of 6 in the context of a major key does also contribute to that modal sound that's happening here. It's a very beautiful moment. We have a passing tone in the bass here as well. Passing leading tone connecting 6 to 1. Usually we get a 4-6 chord in this case, like a D major chord in first inversion here, but here we actually have an F sharp minor chord, which is just a substitute for 4-6, or vice versa. We then have A, E, and C sharp, which is our tonic. 6 going to 1 is always an interesting sound. It's definitely much more abrasive than 4-6 going to 1, so it's interesting how one tone can have that effect on the overall like sonic quality of the progression. And then we have F sharp, A, E, and C sharp. It's kind of like a 6-7 chord happening here, but I'm just going to mark this F sharp as a non-chord tone. The fact that we have a long progression here without any dominance makes the progression feel very static, so it's susceptible to having other tones really influence the effect that the chord has. And I think that's exactly what the passing tones are doing, is we have a very static chord progression that doesn't have a lot of movement, because the chords themselves, generally speaking, have a lot in common in terms of their function, right? We have 6 going to another 6, so that the tones around it really make that difference, rather than the supporting chords, because the rest of the voices are relatively static. They're moving stepwise, or they're staying on the line, so it's interesting. We then have D sharp, A, F sharp, and B. This is another B7 chord over D sharp. In this case, this is 5, 6, 5 of 5, because we're in the key of E now, and B is the dominant of E, and E is our dominant in the key of A major. This B is kind of like turning the chord in root position, but again, this is just a motive that Bach has been using a lot in this particular chorale, but it's also a pattern that Bach uses in many of his chorales, across all of them that I've looked at. It's one of the more common bass lines. So, yeah, I'm not going to mark it as going to root position, because it's getting rid of an important contextual tone, the third of the chord. And then we have E, G sharp, E, and B, which is our dominant E major. 5, 6, 5 of 5 is just 5, 6, 5 of 5 is just a substitute for 2. It's just taking the minor 7 chord and turning it into a dominant 7 chord. It's just the difference between D sharp and D natural. So it's not it's not implying that we are in the key of E or anything crazy like that. But then we cadence on A major, A, C sharp, E, and A, which is our tonic triad. And our last phrase concludes in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. We start things off with A going to F sharp minor, F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A. Again with a phrase starting with an F sharp minor, similar to the beginning of the B section. This is not a 3 chord. This is a 6 chord in the key of A major, but I think I gave away the fact that this is also 3 in the key of D major, because we have D natural immediately. We have, actually there's really no reason for us to think, we have G happening relatively shortly afterwards. I guess we could make the argument that this D major chord that's happening here is 6 going to 4, but honestly to me it feels like the modulation is happening by this point. Is it happening at this point though? Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and stick to my guns and say yes, this progression has been very static regardless. Like if we take out the cadence, we have lots of 1s and 3s and 6s, which are all very similar to one another in terms of their structure, or rather they're similar to the tonic, so it's a very static progression, and those kind of interesting progressions have been consistent throughout the chorale. Lots of use of 3 in this chorale, which is interesting. But we have D major here, D, D, F sharp, and A. You can call this the tonic, or 6 going to 4, and then say that D is the chord that we're modulating over, because we have G natural afterwards. But to me, this is where it happens. It's definitely a zone, and it's open to interpretation. Passing 7th on the bass before we get B, D, F sharp, and G. We could make the art actually. Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and say that is a. How do I want to say it? How do I want to do it? I mean, you could make the art. Yeah, I'm thinking I'm just gonna stick to it. We have B, D, F sharp, and G. That's G major 7 over B. That's a 4/3 chord, and then this A, and E here. These are all contributing to an A7 chord over C sharp, A, E, and G. And the fact that the 7th of the chord is, I'm going to make the argument that this is like a passing 5, 6, 5 chord before we get B, A, E, and F sharp. This E is also functioning like a 4/3 suspension over the bass that again gets derailed by the fact that the bass changes with this step, skip back down gesture that I've commented on at length, because it happens so frequently in this particular chorale. Even just the skip at the end of a a total 4-note bass figure, it's something that happens all the time in this particular chorale. So here we have D, A, E, and F sharp. We could make the argument that this is a tonic triad, and this F is this E is a 9/8 suspension over the bass, but I'm going to make the argument that instead it's actually B, B, D, and F sharp, which is a 6 chord, and this is just a deceptive progression, or we could even call it a 6-6 chord, or a 6 chord in root position, depending on how you view this D. Regardless, it's a chord tone, and this is a very contrapuntal section with the syncopation happening here in the alto, so anyone's guess is as good as mine. I think a tonic triad or a 6 chord is really what's being implied here. But this B feels like it's having more of an effect than the D with the suspension here, because it's an actual complete chord that we could extrapolate from the texture. Alright, looking ahead, we have 6, and the reason why I think 6 is appropriate here more so than 1 is because we have a 2 chord after it, and 6 typically wants to go to 2. 1 can go to 2 as well. 2 going to 1 is a lot less common. We do see it sometimes, but 6 going to 2 is much more common than 1 going to 2, I would say. Here we have G, B, D, and E, which is E minor 7 over G. Bach loves his 2-6-5 chords. We've seen them a number of times in this chorale. Before we get E, G, C sharp, and E. It's kind of like taking the chord and putting it in a root position, but again, this skipping down a third has been a common motive or common gesture in this chorale. And then we have this G is a chord tone. The rest of the notes are chord tones, which means that we're not really marking up this last measure all too much, because we have A, E, C sharp, and E. That's A major in root position, which is our 5 chord. The tenor skips up to A here, that's a chord tone, and then of course we cadence in a perfect authentic fashion due to this being last movement in the cantata. It's D major, D, F sharp, A, and D. And we have worked our way through this monolith, this mammoth of a chorale. I looked at the chorale today and I'm like, oh, we have another short one. It's nice that we've been looking at some short chorales recently, not as long of an analysis to have to produce, but after doing a deep dive, this is definitely an unusual chorale. Very contrapuntal, very dense, very voice leading heavy. When you take into account the fact that the voices are themselves resolving and the chords are always kind of, happening in pieces, like, the chord is there and it's never fully intact at a vertical point in many cases. Sometimes you have to grab a note from outside of the lines and bring it into perspective in order to put a label on what exactly is happening here. But this is a very contrapuntal chorale, so a lot of the harmonic scenarios are a result of notes being grouped together off and on the harmonic grid. So keeping that in mind, sometimes you encounter that. More often than not, you encounter them in cadential situations, but here we see them throughout, and I had to offer a lot of secondary analysis here, or alternative analysis, depending on how you hear it. But honestly, I'm really excited to see what people think about this particular chorale, and if your analysis differs from mine, or if I made any mistakes, because in a chorale that has so many alternate takes and looks on the way that the harmony could be analyzed, I'm really fascinated to see what other people have to say. But on that note, if you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon. You'll be notified of when the video goes live. I upload once a day, so if you want your daily fix of Bach or analysis or both, you're in the right place, and I'd love to have you along on the journey. But on that note, thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.